Hi, this is Matt State of Flex here with a review for Star Trek V, The Final Frontier. This is a Star Trek installment that a lot of the fans really just truly despise. It's probably the most hated Star Trek movie out of the bunch, maybe next to only Star Trek Nemesis, Star Trek Into Darkness, or Star Trek The Motion Picture. However, each of those have their fans that I've talked to. Very few people come to the defense of this, and it's something that has always kind of got my head spinning a little bit, because I don't think this movie is honestly that bad. In fact, I'm going to make the argument that the movie is actually pretty good if you are able to make certain allowances and look past some of the issues that are at play. Those issues are largely stemming from unfortunate pre-production stage, a terrible production stage, and the fact that it's wedged between two titans of quality within the Star Trek franchise. Let's address that first. I think Star Trek V works best not included in that original series set. I think those original movies, there are four that are interconnected, telling a singular story. A singular story that goes from Wrath of Khan, Search for Spock, Voyage Home, directly into the undiscovered country. That is where the original story lay. There's connective tissue linking all of them very firmly together. This one feels like the odd story out, but I don't think it's without its merit. So we're going to address the film's qualities towards the end of this. Let's talk first about that troubled pre-production. And let's talk about something that is kind of hurled at William Shatner that I think is unfair. William Shatner directed this film, and a lot of people point to him as being a bad director. But if he were a bad director, he wouldn't have gotten some of the strongest iconic shots out of this film. I think Star Trek V, well, an ugly movie, and we will touch on that shortly, has some of the best photography, especially nature photography, live location photography, that this series has ever had, especially within those 5 first films. He is able to capture a striking image in that opening scene of the six-legged horse that's riding amongst the dirt that's billowing up behind him, with the cloaked man, and the cloak is like billowing as well. Such a striking image, possibly the best opening of any of the Star Trek films, I think, altogether. I really like that imagery. It's strong, and that opening scene is really quite good. Moving on to the end of the film has quite a big scene done out in live nature, live location, and that stuff is great too. The look of the crew as they're looking at this godlike mountainscape that is in the shape of the Star Trek insignia, the Enterprise insignia, is really quite a memorable shot. And there's quite a few other ones with all the live location shooting. It's when he has the budgetary constraints of filming on sets that we will address again shortly. So I don't think it's fair to call Shatner a bad director. He even pulls some incredibly strong performances from the cast. A cast that he didn't necessarily get along with, or at least he paints it as, unbeknownst to him, they painted as he was always the problem. So it's strange that he would be helming a movie for Star Trek. And a lot of people point to the ego thing of, of course, Leonard Nimoy directed a couple, he had to direct one too. But that's not necessarily how it goes. The reason Shatner directed number 5 was because it was in his contract to do so. Back in the original series, when Star Trek was beginning to bubble up into a small amount of popularity, Shatner and Leonard Nimoy drafted into each other's contracts that whatever allowances one got, the other one would get as well. So when Leonard Nimoy was selected to direct Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, Shatner brought that into the contract negotiations, saying it's always been part of Star Trek that whatever he does, I do as well. And so if he's directing Star Trek 3 and subsequently 4, he wanted to be a director for Star Trek 5. And that makes sense. And coming off of the most successful Star Trek to that point, and second most successful, I think it's now the third most successful Star Trek overall, was Star Trek The Voyage Home, it's strange that this film fell under budgetary constraints, but it was made by a studio who was trying to helm what was kind of being advertised as the final Indiana Jones installment, in that Steven Spielberg was very clearly beginning to want to move away from directing these adventure pictures. He had just come off of The Color Purple, and always he wanted to do stuff that was a little more grounded in a firm sense of reality and not tell pulp fiction as he had been with his early part of his career. So he was moving in a radically different trajectory than his career had taken him to that point, and you see with the films always Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and Hook, then pivoting into Jurassic Park and Schindler's List. Spielberg was moving into a completely different direction with his career. Schindler's List would reshape the type of films that man made, basically for the balance of his career. So Indiana Jones 3, which was 3 of 5, but it was beginning to look like it might only be 3 of 3, started getting a bigger budget, a more global budget. It was something where the studio had to take from other places. And they took from Shatner's film. Shatner's vision and scope had to be whittled down, and that's something people really harp on with this film, is that it isn't like it's telling a grand story, but at a small scale where it almost looks like it's made for television. And it's kind of hard to argue against that when the visual effects, the sets, all that stuff look very TNG, and maybe not even as slick as them. It also had in part to do with the visual effects company, ILM, who had helmed the visual effects from Star Trek 2, 3, and 4, opted not to return for this film so that they could work on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, as well as, I believe, Ghostbusters 2. So they were working with another studio that was so out of their league with the Star Trek thing of it all that it fails to even look as good as Star Trek Next Generation, which was done in part by the ILM crew. So that excuses why it's kind of an ugly movie. The studio was pulling from it, feeling that as successful as Star Trek is and had become, Indiana Jones is the wiser investment. So they were throwing it at that and the TV show because they had hopes that the Next Generation would be the crew to take over from, which within about a 5-year period would in fact be the case. So you have budget being pulled from from the scope of Star Trek V. But even in pre-production it had its issues, which were that Star Trek V was being written at a very rapid pace because the writers' strike was upon us. And when the writers' strike hit, they had to go into production with what they had. And that reads very true when you see the film. It feels like a first or second draft. It's not bad, but the humor for sure is not polished. The humor throughout the entire duration of the film kind of lies flat, and it does feel like first passes at jokes and stuff like that. But it's really those first 40 minutes that are so clunky. They're very, very clunky first 40 minutes, where if that's where you're watching this movie, I can see how you'd get turned off by it. For me, it's the second half of the feature that really pulls its weight and is given strength. I've talked a lot about the negatives of this film. I'm going to talk about one last one, which is this is a very beige movie. The color seems seeped out of it, and that was because they had to work with the sets that were provided. The budget for sets had even been taken from Shatner's film, and he seemed ill-equipped to fight any of these battles with the studio. He seemed to kind of be a director for hire in a weird sense, even though he elected to really and push for this achievement on his career to direct a Star Trek film. He seemed to just be pushed over and agree to these budgetary like missteps that really hurt his film. But they had to shoot on the existing sets from Star Trek Next Generation, the TV show, and redecorate and redoctor them. And that show has a completely different visual vibe by choice than the original series or the original series films had. They have a much more homey vibe, a much more beige vibe. They are lit completely differently. But when you're working with those aspects within the original series crew and trying to repaint those sets to make them kind of look the same, it just created this overall beige quality. And it's just not particularly good looking. Now, those are all the things that I don't think work, and what you wanted me to sit here and bash about this film. So there, I've done it. I've kind of given you excuses and maybe some backstory as to why some of those things are like that, or your feelings are that way. Maybe with some of that historical context, you can be invited to give it a rewatch. And knowing those things, maybe appreciate it a little bit more. But this is a movie that I liked even the very first time I saw it. I had heard so many bad things that when I saw this film, I was expecting it to just be terrible. And as I say, those first 40 minutes are a little clunky, but I never found them out and out bad. It just wasn't nearly as good as the previous couple films that I'd watched within the franchise. But when I got to the back half, I was like, why do people not really like this? I have a theory, and I'll pitch that to you later, but I like what Shatner's doing with this film. Essentially what he did was, Gene Roddenberry, when he was trying to get the Star Trek movies off the ground, wrote a screenplay called The God Thing. And it was this godlike entity that presented itself as the actual one true God, and the Kirk and crew encountered it and disproved it. With Roddenberry being a firm atheist, it landed very firm against any kind of theism. And so naturally the studio was like, we can't do this. I liked Shatner's taking of that principal idea, which I don't think is a bad idea, I think it's a compelling idea, and refascinating it to something that was happening in television around the time this movie was being made, and that was the rise of televangelism. This film is a firm critique against televangelism, and the Sybok character, Spock's brother, which is its own can of worms I might touch on at the end, is definitely a reinforcement of that kind of televangelist idea. In fact, my favorite scene in the movie, and I think one of the best scenes of Star Trek overall, is the scene where he gets he's being criticized by Kirk, Spock, and Bones, and then goes to Bones, and Bones is like, show me what it is that you do to change people's minds. And he talks to him, and he gets the man to open up about a terrible darkness in his past, and to let go of that feeling, let go of that. And if you've ever watched a televangelist speak with a person who's very troubled and whatnot, that scene reads so authentic to that style of televisual manipulation. and the tactics that are used to get people to wholeheartedly fall into some belief system like that. It's an excellent capturing of that story. And I like that this film is exploring the rise of televangelism through the Star Trek means, where they're in an agnostic universe. And this film plays it far more agnostic than Roddenberry's firm stance against theism. In fact, I love Shatner's final lines in the film where he's saying, or Bones is like, "Do you think there really is a God?" And he's like, "Sure there is. I think God's in here, in the human's heart." Saying once and for all that Kirk believes that it's man that guides his own life. Call it what you will, call it God, call it a conscience, call it whatever. It's the human heart, human nature that drives us forward to boldly go where no man has gone before. And that's something that I found really striking. So anyway, a lot of people will critique the godness of it, but I actually think if you look at it in the context of when it came out, had a little something stronger to say than most people give it credit for. I also, I feel like people who are mostly against this film are one of two camps. Either the ones that are very firmly religious, that are like, hey, this movie's kind of adding me, I don't like that. Or you get the people that are like, ugh, I don't want religion in my Star Trek, like, just get this away. But I think it works, for me at least. I thought it was really interesting, I thought it was really compelling. I like the back half of this movie a lot. A lot of people make fun of that, what does God need with a starship moment, but it worked for me. It was a logical attack on this alien being, this God thing that wasn't the one true God, but it was a godlike entity that was manipulating people. And some people are like, how is it that this being can cast itself into Sybok and his visions and all that kind of stuff? That doesn't make any sense. I'd just like to redirect you to one of the most popular episodes, written in fact by Gene Roddenberry, called The Menagerie, which was the reimagining of The Cage, in that the Thulosians are able to cast a visual, across, quadrants to get to Spock and crew and Pike and Kirk and all of them. So it's been established since season 1 that there are aliens with enough mental strength to be able to do something like that. I do wish that we'd gotten the original ending where the rocks come to life and stuff like that, which got carried over into Galaxy Quest of all things, which I'll probably be reviewing soon, right after I'm done reviewing Star Trek Picard. Yeah, so I like this movie. I think it has some incredibly strong scenes. I really like the scene where I genuinely think that's one of the best scenes of any Star Trek movie, where Sybok is confronting Bones with his horrid past, confronting Spock with his father's detest of his human nature, even from the moment of his birth. And then when he goes to Kirk to try to release his pain, and Kirk pleads with him that, no, I like my pain, I need my pain. I wouldn't be with me without my pain. That is who I am and what makes me me. And that, I think, is a really compelling idea and notion. I like how some of the characters are completely wooed by Sybok, and I like how this film creates a kind of unity amongst the galaxy. And that's kind of also why I feel like it fits better after Star Trek Beyond. Star Trek Beyond ends with a picture from this film, and it is kind of teasing as this being the future. And it washes away the whole, like, how in the world does Spock have a brother that nobody's ever talked about? It, like, repaints that to be like, well, that happened and it's an alternate timeline, whatever. It washes that away. It does make the two references to Spock's death hard to swallow if you're watching it after Star Trek Beyond. That's something that only fits in the original canon timeline, but just like plug your ears during those. That said, I think it fits better with a post-Star Trek Beyond because it also gives you one, like, you got to say your big goodbye to Leonard Nimoy and to Spock, but you didn't get to say goodbye to the whole crew the same way you did. And the weight of mortality lays heavy in this film, especially for Kirk, his fears that he's going to die alone. And I like the last little bit of a notion that these characters will kind of ride off into the sunset. It's nowhere near as strong of a conclusion as Star Trek Undiscovered Country, but as a second goodbye, I think this works for me. So that's why I watch it in this order within the timeline. I like this movie. I don't know what to tell you. I think it has several strong scenes all in the back half of the film. I even like the confrontation with what does God need with a spaceship? I'm cool with it. I will say though, this film follows to a T William Shatner's unusual cadence in its pacing. The movie will go kind of slow, almost on the verge of being laborious, and then we'll move at rapid pace, and then slow down once more. But then you get a fast move, and it'll be loud, and then it goes soft again. And it just kind of has like this unusual pace. I don't think it's a bad pace. It moves swiftly, but it's just so unusually paced. And when I hit that it kind of matches Shatner's cadence that he uses as Kirk, it tickled me. But yeah, I also find it amusing that, of course, William Shatner has himself scaling, or like free solo climbing El Capitan in the beginning of the film. That made me giggle. But anyway, I like this movie. Have at it. Take me down to nothing. I know that I am in the minority unliking this, but I hope I opened your eyes to at least some of the reasons why it might not have been as successful as some of the previous entries, or maybe even got you to look at the film a little bit differently. So let me know what you think of this film in the comments section down below. Next week we will be moving on to The Next Generation with Star Trek Insurrection. Thanks for watching, like, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Peace.